Empires rarely fall because they are conquered. History shows us time and again that they collapse when authority at the center breaks down and those at the periphery stop complying. Rome did not fall to barbarians at the gates until its provinces had already ceased to believe in the authority of the capital. The British Empire did not unravel because of a single external shock, but because the machinery holding it together no longer functioned. The Soviet Union dissolved not with an invasion, but with quiet refusals from within. That is the lens through which today's events must be understood. This was not a footnote. It was not a bureaucratic anomaly. It happened in full view under cameras with prepared statements and national flags. At precisely 9:08 this morning Eastern Time, inside a conference room at Toronto's Fairmont Royal York Hotel, 10 sitting governors of the United States met openly with the Prime Minister of Canada and signed a formal economic cooperation framework without the approval of the White House, without consultation with the State Department, and without so much as a courtesy call to the Oval Office. These were not marginal figures. They were the elected leaders of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Washington State, California, and Maine. Collectively, these states represent a combined GDP of nearly $9 trillion and a population of 122 million people, a block larger economically and demographically than most advanced nations on Earth. These are not peripheral regions. They are the industrial and electoral backbone of the American Republic. Their decision was not ideological. It was economic. These states manufacture America's vehicles, grow its food, power its electricity grid, and anchor its technology sector. Their factories rely on Canadian components. Their refineries rely on Canadian oil. Their power grids depend on Canadian electricity. Their farmers depend on Canadian rail corridors. And today, each of those governors concluded that the federal government and the president personally had become a direct threat to that economic reality. The agreement they signed, known as the Great Lakes Pacific Economic Continuity Accord, is not a treaty. Governors cannot sign treaties. The Constitution is explicit on that point. But it is far more than a symbolic gesture. It is a binding framework committing these states to maintain uninterrupted trade with Canada regardless of federal tariff actions. It establishes coordinated supply chains, emergency energy guarantees, cross-border workforce arrangements, and a dispute resolution mechanism that deliberately bypasses federal courts. In practical terms, 10 American states have constructed an economic firewall, not against a foreign power, but around their own federal government. The message to Washington could not be clearer. Impose tariffs if you wish, threaten borders if you must, shout from podiums if that is your preference. But these states will continue trading with Canada because their jobs, their tax bases, and their economic survival depend on it. They are no longer willing to sacrifice real livelihoods to preserve presidential pride. The White House has labeled the move treasonous. Legal scholars describe it as unprecedented. Historians are already comparing it to the nullification crisis of the 19th century, the most serious challenge to federal authority in nearly 2 centuries. The Canadian Prime Minister, by contrast, treated it as routine. While Washington fixated on rhetoric and grievance, he was working the phones, not with federal officials, but with governors, mayors, chief executives, and union leaders whose workers cross the border daily. He did not attempt to pressure the White House. He simply went around it. And crucially, he arrived with something the federal government did not: detailed economic modeling. Each governor was presented with hard numbers, job losses, factory closures, collapsing tax revenues, and a clear explanation of what would happen if the border hardened. Then came the alternative, a legal framework to preserve trade, protect supply chains, and stabilize state economies. This was not a request for disloyalty. It was an offer of insulation. 10 governors, including 6 Republicans, accepted. They concluded that their constitutional duty to protect their constituents outweighed any obligation to protect the president's ego. In doing so, they exposed a fundamental truth. The modern American economy cannot function without Canada, and no amount of presidential bluster can override supply chains, labor markets, or arithmetic. What happened today was not a partisan rebellion. It was a structural fracture. The United States is beginning to divide not along cultural or ideological lines, but along economic ones. States whose prosperity depends on cross-border trade are separating themselves from federal policies that threaten that trade. This is not 10 governors rebelling against America. It is 10 governors attempting to preserve it. And the fault line now runs straight through the center of the republic. To understand how this happened, you have to rewind 8 days. The moment did not begin in Toronto. It began late at night in Lansing, Michigan, in the office of Governor Gretchen Whitmer, with a spreadsheet and a phone call. At 2:47 in the morning, the president announced via social media that he was imposing an immediate 50% emergency tariff on all Canadian automotive components entering the United States. The justification followed a familiar pattern: claims of unfairness, grievance, and wounded pride. Canada, he said, was freeloading. Canada was stealing jobs. Canada was laughing at America. By 6:10 that same morning, before the first factory shift in Detroit had even clocked in, supply chain alarms were already sounding. Procurement teams across the automotive sector began running emergency diagnostics. Ford identified 340 components affected by the tariff. General Motors flagged 287. Stellantis identified more than 400. These were not finished vehicles. They were the invisible parts, wiring harnesses, sensors, sub-assemblies that crossed the US-Canada border multiple times during production. This matters because modern manufacturing is not linear. A wiring harness, the nervous system of a modern vehicle, crosses the border 4 times before installation. A 50% tariff does not simply add 50% to its cost. It compounds at every crossing. By the time the vehicle rolls off the line, the effective tariff on certain components exceeds 200%. The industry's emergency modeling team ran the numbers within hours. Their findings were delivered directly to the governor's office in a 2-page memo. The conclusion was stark. If the tariff remained in place for 30 days, 143,000 Michigan auto workers would be furloughed. 12 assembly plants would halt production. State revenues would fall by nearly $5 billion in a single quarter. Unemployment would surge from just over 4% to nearly 10%, not over years, but in weeks. All of this triggered by a single online post. Governor Whitmer read the memo and immediately began making calls. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota. By midnight, 7 governors were on a conference line. By 2 in the morning, there were 9. By dawn, 10. But the decisive call was not between governors. At 11:47 p.m., Whitmer dialed a number in Ottawa. She spoke to the Canadian Prime Minister for 94 minutes. According to sources familiar with the conversation, this was not a plea for help. It was a conversation both sides had anticipated. The Canadian government had already prepared for this scenario. The framework was drafted. The legal structure had been vetted. The economic modeling had been completed. State by state, district by district, factory by factory. This was not improvisation. It was pre-engineering. The message was simple. Canada could guarantee supply chains. It could guarantee energy flows. It could ensure that Canadian components would continue crossing the border at existing prices, regardless of federal tariffs. But in return, the cooperation needed to be formal, transparent, and legally defensible. When asked what she should tell the White House, the response was blunt. Tell them you are protecting your constituents. That is your job. Within 48 hours, Canadian trade officials were on planes, first to Lansing, then Columbus, then Harrisburg, then Albany. Each state received a customized economic impact package, 10 states, 10 documents, 10 sets of numbers that all pointed to the same conclusion. Each package detailed trade exposure, projected job losses, expected budget shortfalls, and consumer price increases. And on the final page, a single paragraph outlined the alternative, a framework that would preserve trade, stabilize employment, and neutralize the tariff shock. At the bottom of that page was a line for a signature. This was not a political gamble, it was a mathematical one. The governors were not asked to speculate. They were shown precisely how many jobs would vanish, how many factories would close, and how quickly their states would slide into recession if they did nothing. The decision was not framed as loyalty versus defiance, it was framed as action versus collapse. And that framing made the outcome inevitable. 6 of the governors who signed the agreement were Republicans. That detail matters, and it bears repeating. These were not political opponents of the president. These were governors who rely on his endorsement, who have appeared at his rallies, who have campaigned beneath his banners. They are figures embedded within his political coalition. And yet, when confronted with the data, they chose differently. They examined the employment projections, they studied the factory shutdown timelines, they reviewed the revenue losses facing their state budgets, and they concluded that allegiance to the White House could not outweigh responsibility to their voters. One Republican governor, speaking anonymously to the Associated Press, distilled the decision into a single sentence that may come to define this period in American politics. I can survive the president being angry at me. I cannot survive 200,000 people in my state losing their jobs. That was the calculation. And once the calculation was made, the decision followed. This is the essence of the current American trade crisis. It is not driven by ideology, party loyalty, or political identity. It is driven by arithmetic, cold, indifferent, nonpartisan arithmetic. And the arithmetic is unambiguous. For these 10 states, economic survival depends more on Canada than on the approval of one man. That brings us to the substance of what was actually signed. The Great Lakes Pacific Economic Continuity Accord is not symbolic. It is an operational framework with legal force and economic architecture. Its purpose is simple: to ensure that trade continues even if federal policy attempts to disrupt it. The first provision concerns supply chains. Canada commits to maintaining existing export volumes of automotive components, steel, aluminum, lumber, and agricultural products to the participating states at pre-tariff prices. Should federal tariffs be imposed, the states and Canada will jointly operate a tariff absorption mechanism that neutralizes the cost increase for businesses operating within the framework. In practical terms, a factory in Michigan will pay the same price for a Canadian component regardless of presidential trade announcements. The tariff technically exists, but its economic impact is removed. The second provision guarantees energy continuity. Canada commits to uninterrupted electricity exports to the participating states at current rates for a minimum of 5 years. This is particularly significant for states such as New York, which sources a substantial share of its electricity from Quebec hydropower, and Minnesota, which relies on Canadian energy to supply its northern regions. If federal authorities attempt to restrict energy imports, emergency provisions allow states to procure electricity directly through municipal utilities, bypassing federal customs controls. The third provision addresses workforce mobility. The accord establishes an expedited system for recognizing professional credentials across the border. Engineers, tradespeople, healthcare workers, and technology specialists can move between Canada and the participating states with streamlined approval. The logic is straightforward. Supply chains require not only components, but skilled labor. The fourth provision is the most legally consequential. The accord creates a bilateral dispute resolution panel composed of Canadian trade officials and representatives from the participating states, not federal officials. Commercial disputes arising within the framework are resolved through this panel rather than through federal courts or the U.S. Trade Representative. In effect, the governors have constructed a parallel trade governance mechanism operating alongside, but independently of, federal authority. It is unprecedented, it is legally contentious, and according to trade lawyers consulted by multiple parties, it is likely lawful. The Constitution grants the federal government authority over treaties and tariffs. It does not prohibit states from cooperating with foreign governments on economic development, energy procurement, or workforce coordination. The distinction is narrow, but it is decisive. The governors found the opening. The Canadian legal team built the framework to pass through it, and Washington is now confronting the reality that the structure is already in place. Washington's response to the accord reveals just how destabilizing it is. Within 90 minutes of the signing ceremony in Toronto, the White House convened an emergency legal review. The question placed on the table was stark and singular. Can this be stopped? According to multiple sources with direct knowledge of that meeting, the initial response was silence. What followed was an admission rarely heard inside the executive branch. They were not sure. The most powerful legal apparatus in the world, backed by the full authority of the federal government, could not immediately identify a clear mechanism to prevent 10 states from continuing to trade with Canada. The reason is straightforward. While the president can impose tariffs, he cannot compel a state to stop purchasing electricity from abroad. He cannot force ports to close to lawful goods. He cannot order governors to dismantle economic relationships that fall within their constitutional authority. 3 legal strategies are now reportedly under consideration. The first invokes the Compact Clause of Article 1, which requires congressional approval for interstate compacts. The difficulty here is structural. The accord is not an agreement between states. Each state signed individually with Canada. There is no interstate compact to approve or reject. The second argument asserts that the accord infringes on the president's exclusive authority over foreign affairs. But the framework explicitly avoids national security, defense, or diplomacy. It deals instead with economic development, energy procurement, and workforce coordination, areas traditionally reserved to the states under the 10th Amendment. The third option is executive action, declaring the accord void under emergency economic powers. But executive orders do not override constitutional authority. Any such action would be challenged immediately, likely reaching the Supreme Court months later, by which point the accord would be fully operational. At that stage, dismantling it would inflict economic damage exceeding that of the original tariffs. The administration is discovering that it has boxed itself in. The tariffs were so severe, so economically disruptive, that 10 governors judged constitutional confrontation to be less dangerous than compliance. That alone marks a profound shift in American governance. What makes this rupture even more significant is the political context. The 6 Republican governors who signed did so despite intense pressure from their own party organizations. State party chairs intervened. Major donors called. National Republican officials warned of consequences. The governors listened, reviewed the employment data, examined factory closure timelines, and signed anyway. They understood the political reality. A governor presiding over the loss of 200,000 jobs does not survive a primary. A governor who defies the president might. The calculation was brutally simple. Survival outweighed loyalty. This is the sound of a coalition beginning to fracture. Markets, as ever, reach their verdict quickly. Capital does not respond to rhetoric, it responds to risk. Following the announcement, American automotive stocks surged as investors priced in stabilized supply chains. State bonds across the participating states rallied as the accord was interpreted as fiscal insurance, a guarantee of revenue continuity and employment stability. By contrast, the U.S. dollar weakened. When 10 states signal their intention to operate independently of federal trade policy, investors see fragmentation. Fragmentation introduces risk. Risk drives selling. The Canadian dollar strengthened. Canadian equities rose. Stability was rewarded. The volatility index spiked into crisis territory, not because of war or pandemic, but because the federal government found itself in open conflict with its own states. Markets fear uncertainty above all else, and the uncertainty now is structural. The Canadian Prime Minister's press conference later that day was revealing in its restraint. Speaking without American flags behind him, he framed the issue carefully. Canada's economic relationship, he said, had never been with a single office or individual, but with the American people, workers, farmers, engineers, families. Those elected to represent them had asked for continuity, and Canada had agreed. When challenged on accusations of treason from Washington, he responded with a line that will echo for years. Treason is the destruction of your own nation's economic foundations for personal ego. Canada, he said, had not caused the fracture. It had merely offered a bridge across it. That framing matters. This is not a clash between two countries. It is a confrontation between economic reality and political authority. And at the center of it lies a deeper explanation. The president's power rests on fear. Fear of retaliation, fear of exclusion, fear of political ruin. That model works until fear collides with survival. When obedience guarantees economic collapse, fear loses its grip. The governors were not heroic. They were cornered, presented with projections that showed mass unemployment, collapsing revenues, and long-term damage. They chose arithmetic over allegiance. They chose their states over a man. That is why control is slipping. Fear can compel compliance, but it cannot override mathematics. And when governance confronts arithmetic, arithmetic always wins. This is not a moment of political drama. It is a structural warning. When central authority becomes economically destructive, power does not vanish. It relocates. And that process, once begun, is exceptionally difficult to reverse.